Hi. Hi, T-Vac. What's going on? It's super dark in my office right now because it's shitty out. So, forgive the weird lights and stuff. Um, I'm gonna jump in here on Will and Grace. I was laughing at the comments because most of you expressed confusion from the show. Um, I was really confused by what was happening. Yeah, I hadn't really thought of that. So like with this episode, like those aren't all recurring characters. Like the lesbians like never appear again. Um and Natasha Lyonne's character, the intern, like that's her only episode. So the main characters are Jack and Will, Grace, and Karen, Megan Mullally's character, the sort of obnoxious secretary for Grace. That's the that's the cast basically. Um, so yeah, I apologize for that, but I think it's interesting the way you guys all kind of worked through it and like tried to make sense of it and did a pretty good job of that. So I appreciate you sticking it out, as it were. Um, so Will and Grace, I talked in class about kind of the timeline of the show, right? So we were talking about sexuality last week. We did the 1993 Seinfeld episode that was about um, a lot of this stuff. And then we did the 1996 Boy Meets World episode that kind of dealt with, not in a less overt way, dealt with sexuality. So this is 1990. Actually, this is season 3. So this is probably like 2000 or something. But the show started in 1998. And yes, Vicky, Amanda, those of you who were confused, Will is gay. Will is openly gay. Um, and Jack is too, obviously. So, um, started in 98. This episode was probably 2000. In there, in this timeline, you have to put Ellen DeGeneres. She had she had a sitcom in 94 and came out of the closet. I've talked about this in class. She came out of the closet on the show and in real life in 1997. And the show was swiftly canceled, basically. Um, I told you, I think they put like a one after she came out, ABC put like a parental advisory before every episode. Like there's a gay person on the show. Yeah, awesome. Um, so it is interesting to see that. I was talking about it. Yeah, Jackie was talking about that moment is such an interesting moment in this timeline of sexuality or the LGBTQ plus community's representation on TV. Um, and Jackie was talking about Ellen kind of took the hit for everybody, uh, and sort of knocked down the door and rushed the gates of representation. It was like, I'm doing this. She bore the brunt of a lot of the criticism. She got canceled, but in its wake came Will and Grace. Now, was Will and Grace a move forward or backward? Yeah, it's a lot of you were feeling that, like, this is, you know, this is kind of tone deaf. But again, your 2021 lens is, your is certainly more fine tuned than the 2000 lens was in terms of LGBTQ plus issues and all things like that. So you kind of have to look at it like Sex in the City. Remember we talked about Sex in the City was, okay, this huge leap forward for women just right out the gate for representation alone, right? Four different independent women with different personalities, different hair colors. That's big. Um, but just representing more of a breadth of femininity and womanhood. Like that was a huge step forward. And then if you keep watching the show, you're like, okay, it starts to sort of trickle back, um, take steps back and then forward, and you hope by the end you've moved the needle forward. Will and Grace is the same kind of dynamic, right? Um, it's it's really the first two openly gay characters on TV. I mean, besides Ellen, obviously, but certainly that vaulted into the mainstream and sort of became wildly popular. It was a super popular show. This wasn't something like, oh, they did a couple seasons and then this was big. It was a big show. And they just did a reboot, actually, recently, which is interesting. I haven't seen those yet. I probably should. To see, like we've talked about all semester, like how do they address the problems, the problematic issues that they were dealing with, or ways in which they were dealing with sexuality and stuff in the early 2000s. If they address it at all, assuming they do. So it's, and I could see all of you evaluating that in your comments. Like, okay, it's super backward, right? A lot of the stuff is, pretty archaic. But again, I'm talking 20 years of hopefully progress for the LGBTQ plus community concerning its representation on TV and how we sort of um, understand it more. And this was the first step, I guess, if you look at it that way, right? We've taken many steps. This was one of the first. Um, so, yeah, you have to keep that in mind while you're watching it. Um, yeah, like Sex and the City, it's a move forward in representation with Jack and Will because in the past it was you just get Jack, right? If you got a gay character, he was completely marginalized and, you know, a just raging stereotype of flamboyant over the top. Like, and this is to Jack Lynn's comment about, you mentioned Jack as the he's a representation of the unacceptable gay character, but I'm like, I disagree. Jack was being portrayed as the feminine, sassy, catty, stereotypical gay man, the embodiment of gay stereotype that was deemed unacceptable. I think it's the other way around. That is the one that sort of heteronormative America was okay with, right? The one we didn't need to take seriously, the one that was just like this clown, this sort of jester or whatever. there for our amusement and nothing more, to be sort of laughed at. Um, and when it didn't, like Will was sort of the transgressive gay character, because some of you didn't even know. And the show's called Will and Grace, which you could kind of feel this show hedging itself. Like, we don't want to go all in on the gay thing. So let's kind of, you know, yeah, let's go lightly a little bit here. Um, so I think Jack, Jack is the acceptable one. Like, that's the one we're comfortable with as a culture, or as a at the time a primarily heteronormative culture. Is like, that's the one I understand. I can, yeah. But if you don't fit into that stereotype, then I don't know what to do with you. And that's Will, right? Will is that. Then it's like you're trying to trick me and all this. I know, ridiculous, but that's how I kind of see it. Um, but Jack and Will are, at least, right? You have two gay characters representing two different, homosexual identities, and all the things that sort of go with that. It's, yes, it's two, but that's twice as many as one, and double none, right? So progress, I guess. Um, yeah, a lot of you focused on the infighting within the LGBTQ plus community here, right? And that's an old trope, that gays hate lesbians and vice versa. It's an old trope. I can't speak to the sort of accuracy of that, but in this episode, it sort of serves that function of, like, I think this was a popular sentiment in the late 90s and early 2000s. And I don't know that it's changed. I don't know enough about it. But it certainly was a sentiment that this community was divided, right? But you've seen all the time. Every marginalized group goes through these growing pains as they're sort of emerging and seeking equality. Women, I mean, we've talked about it with feminism, like the whole idea, like, you're doing it wrong. Like, women, in many cases, are their own, not their own worst enemy, but you know what I'm saying. Like, there are women who aren't on board with feminism and things like that, and equality. Right? There's infighting. Racial infighting is, you know, rampant. Chris Rock talks about it a lot in his stand up, among others. But, like, if we can't get all of us on the same page, or most of us on the same page, like, it's never, you know, forget about the white man. Like, we're holding ourselves back. And I think that's something that this episode really deals with, right? Jack is, like, disgusted by these women. Like, he treats them the way the way he gets treated all the time, right? From straight people or whatever it is, right? So he's too shallow to even see that. Like, he doesn't like being treated that way. But that also establishes, like, this, and this probably was true at the time, this hierarchy within the community. Like, even though L is the first one, LGBT, I think the the gay male community sort of had taken the reins, I guess. And you see it in this episode, like, there's a hierarchy, and gays are at the top of it. Like, it's I think every group wants to have some sort of power, right? You want to seize some sort of power. So this was an opportunity for we're above you at least, and it seems counterintuitive, but I think it's innate, like to sort of go through those growing pains when you're trying to kind of dig yourself out of a hole, as it were. Um, so yeah, they really highlight the dissension within the community. I think that's an important thing that shouldn't be overlooked. Um, what is that? Oh, it's a call, and Will tries to facilitate this, you know, unity, right? He tries to convince Jack that, we need them for this presentation, and the whole thing with the presentation is a metaphor. Like, that's my take. So it would make sense that Will's like, we need these lesbians, we need everybody from the community to be involved with this, right? We can't be, our message will be completely diluted or fractured if we don't have contributions from, everybody. And the presentation to the cops at the end, it is like, think about it becomes this allegory or this metaphor for what the show is and could be. And Thomas talked about it in his comment, um, about the meta. It's the writers talking to the audience through their characters. It does get pretty interesting, I think. But the show, Will and Grace, at the time, like the presentation to the cops, sort of fails to give depth to the LGBTQ plus perception, the perception of them, and their community in general. So Will is trying to make this happen. He's like, we need the lesbians, right? We need a united front. Um, and Jack doesn't want to do it. He ends up, ruining it in the end. Like, that's a metaphor. And what we got here? Yeah, so it's another call for the community to unite. And if you look at this episode um, as sort of like the Cosby thing, right, where Cosby takes these scenes to talk directly to his critics and his audience, right? Saying, I think that this has the same kind of feeling. Exploration versus exploitation. What are we doing here? I think it's a little of both, maybe. Like Will's character is exploring gay identity, and Jax is exploiting it for laughs. I mean, the Hummer joke, like, really? And of course, the cop's name is Cox. Like, duh. And those are so bad, like, cringy bad. It's like, oh man, they had to really jump through some hoops to get those Hummer jokes in there, because right? It's a douchebag's truck, but it's also balls. Hilarious. Um, so I think it does both. I think this show does both. Tries to do both, and that's just not a good look. I don't think. Um, yeah, that's a different. Um, One of the big criticisms of the show, in hindsight, was, it's supposed to be this sort of pro-gay, this gay advocate, and but there's never most, if not all, intimacy is heteronormative, which is kind of counterintuitive to the whole LGBTQ plus thing. It's like, yeah, they went right up to the line and they were like, they turned around. So most of the intimacy in the show is between Will and Grace. Not, and again, it's not, they don't have sex or anything, but they they share a bed together all the time and they're really close and they're intimate. They might kiss maybe, and it's any intimacy is generally between Will and Grace and Jack and Karen. Jack and Karen are inseparable in that they're both completely shallow and self-obsessed and narcissists and things like that. So they obviously, so there's no homosexual intimacy if the guys go on dates with somebody. You know, it's just there for the joke fodder. Seemingly, there might be like a peck on the cheek or something, like a kiss, but nothing exploring that, right? And I'm not calling for just, you know, fisting on NBC, must see TV by any means, but I think we can all agree that you can achieve and advocate for normalizing intimacy without, being graphic or, you know, obnoxious about it. And they don't seek to do that at all, which is a major knock on the show. Um, so there's the back and forth between Jack and Will, where they get in a fight, right? The lesbians leave, they get in a fight, and they start just basically throwing gay, sort of gay jokes back at each other. And to me, like, if you listen to that, like, they're both calling each other out for being themselves. And that's like, it goes back to a theme that we've developed over the course of the semester, which is like, there's no one way to be a thing. But they are acting like there is, right? So Jack is calling Will all these things. He's saying, you're being gay wrong, basically. And Will retaliates with the same, like, you're doing it wrong, right? Being flamboyant and over the top. And so their little fight there is like, you know, implying that there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it, when we know that's not true. There's just, and when you think there is, like, that's where a lot of our culture suffers, is this belief that there is a right way to be a man, be a woman, be gay, be straight, be black, be white, be Asian, be whatever. When we start thinking there is a right way or a single way, that's when it all goes to shit. And here, Jack and Will are basically accusing the other of being gay wrong. And they realize it. Like, I think the pivotal part of this episode is when Will says, he's talking to Jack and he's like, we really blew it. This is a quote. We really blew it. We had the perfect opportunity to open some minds. Like, to me, that's the writers saying, we, the show, Will and Grace, blew it. This is season 3. So, like, maybe they're like, this is a pivotal episode. We really blew it. We had a perfect opportunity to open some minds. And to me, they're speaking about the show itself, not just the presentation. Um, we had this opportunity, but we kind of fell back on just Jack being insane and Will trying to corral that insanity or flamboyance or whatever it is, with the Hummer jokes. And then, boom, they drop the Officer Cox because, you know. So, yeah, I think there's a lot here. Uh, and your comments, like Peter, Matt, Alice, a lot of you talked about the dissension in the ranks of the LGBTQ plus community. And think about that community. That community has seemingly more obstacles because it's such a diverse. It's not just like African Americans. Okay, that's pretty, you know, that's pretty unified already, but you have lesbian, gay, trans, bi, queer, you know, everything. Like that's a lot to bring together, you know. That's a lot of identities and concerns and sort of beliefs to bring together. Um, so I think it's only natural that this episode, this show, deals with that in some way. But I think the takeaway is Will understands like we need to be united. We need to have a united front here, or else nothing's gonna work. The whole our presentation to heteronormative America is going to fail if we don't have these lesbians to if we don't bring in lesbians and let everyone be heard, right? um Eric, yeah, I think a bunch of you had this sentiment too. This this show does a lot to create polarizing views of um, homosexuals, of gay people. um but I guess maybe that's a good thing. Like, I think it we'd rather have polarizing views than just, you know, I think stereotypical ones, right? Like, yeah, this understanding that gay just doesn't just look like Jack. I think is a big move. Um, Andrea, Andrea, among others, like, all right, so who's gay, right? So the only gay characters are Will and Jack. That's it. Um, and again, I think that sort of confusion is part of the show dealing with reflecting our culture's confusion about, you know, all of this stuff, right? And the sort of the reluctance to really show gay identity and represent it, right? With Will and Grace and Jack and Karen's relationships really being the most intimate of all of them. And I feel like I can't remember, but Jack and Will never get together, or they might have hooked up like years ago or something, like before the show began, in that timeline. But I don't think they do during the show. Um, Ryan, yeah, more of the same with, but he's saying the show dealt with discrimination from both inside and outside the community and how that's a very real thing. I think it's played in this episode for laughs, which kind of diminishes the meaning of it a little bit with the whole Jack versus the lesbians thing. But if you focus on Will's insistence that they be a part of this, that we treat them with respect and things like that, that's the takeaway. That's I think they got that right, for sure. Another Vicky, yes, Will is gay. Talked about Jackie. Jackie talked about Ellen taking the hit. Um, I talked about Jack, and um, that's about it. Um, so Will and Grace, it wasn't ever my favorite, but a lot of people loved it. So I appreciate you guys working through it. Amanda, did you really watch the episode twice? I appreciate it. All right, guys. See you.